Chapter 24 Down a Hole. The company of miners peered into the blackness of the cave hole and strained to hear anything that might tell them how Arliss was doing. It seemed an age before they heard his voice echoing up from the depths. Bottom, dum, dum. Aiden was next. Backing hand over hand down the rope, he soon lost sight of the winking starlight and found himself in absolute darkness. It was comfortably cool down the hole. The muggy warmth of the summer night didn't penetrate below the surface. Neither did the smells of the green world make their way into the cave. Above ground, the leafy odors of grass and shrub and faint perfumes of flower and berry were so constant that Aiden rarely even realized he was breathing them. But down the cave hole, he smelled nothing but muddy clay. The entry tunnel wasn't a straight drop, but rather a steep slope leading down to the innards of the earth. The limestone offered poor footing. Aiden hugged the climbing rope tightly as he inched through the narrow chute. The miners above made no noise, nor was there any noise from below. Aiden could hear only his own short breaths and the pounding of blood in his temples. Of all his five senses, only the sense of touch was left to him, so he was very aware of the textures around him. In places, the limestone was as smooth as wavy glass and just as slippery. In others, it was as rough and embedded gravel, and sliding over it was a misery. Twice he bumped his head on protruding rocks that would have surely left nasty gashes had he not been wearing his miner's helmet. At last, Aiden heard a noise above him. Thick, thick, thick. Arliss, he called tentatively. Is that you? It's me, came back Arliss's echoing voice. To Aiden's relief, it didn't sound very far away. Chick, chick, chick. Trying to strike a fire, Arliss remarked, but it's mighty damp down here. Aiden was out of the entry tunnel now and able to stand up straight. He called back up the chute. Bottom! Dum, dum, The slightest sound echoed all around the chamber where he now stood. Welcome to the underworld, chuckled Arliss in the pitch blackness. Have a look around. Chick, chick, chick. A few strides away, Aiden saw three sparks in succession. He heard Arliss grumbling in frustration. He stepped carefully toward the sparks, hoping not to stumble on an upthrust rock or break his nose on a hanging stalactite. Chick, chick, chick. At last the spark caught on a little pile of dry tinder and became a tiny licking flame. Aiden saw the knuckly silhouette of Arliss's hands reach toward the flame with a splinter of fat lighter, which burst into a yellow blaze. The dim light illuminated a smile of relief and satisfaction on the young miner's narrow face. He took up one of the cane torches at his feet and dropped the flaming splinter among the shaggy fibers at the top. They quickly caught, and the hot burning pine pitch popped and snapped. He handed the lit torch to Aiden and held out the second torch to borrow fire from Aiden's. Their eyes had grown accustomed to total darkness, so even the muted light cast by the torches seemed bright. But soon their eyes adjusted, and the boys were astonished to see what sort of cave they were in. It was an enormous chamber, much bigger than King Darrow's great hall. The walls, floors, and ceilings were carved out of glittering white limestone. Great swaths of golden brown and burnt red rock seemed to move across the walls like cloud formations. The floor of the cave sloped down to an underground lake where the water was so clear that the stone below the surface was no less visible than the stone at the water's edge. But where the water grew deep as any ocean by the looks of it, it took on a greenish blue hue. Aiden and Arliss stood wordlessly, trying to take in the scene before them. Behind them they heard a grunt, and two boots appeared at the end of the entry chute, followed by the legs, the thick round body, and the head and arms of Ernest. He stood blinking in the torchlight, rubbing a banged elbow and stretching a sword's backbone. When his eyes adjusted, he staggered back a step, amazed at the scene. Good heavens! He exclaimed, and his voice echoed around the chamber. To think! Such a world as this was right below our feet, and we never knew it! The three remaining miners appeared in their turns, with Gustus bringing up the rear. Each was as awestruck as the other, but each also understood that the beauty of the place didn't lessen its danger. All right, boys, began Gustus. We got a wet cave. That means we got to be very careful of our fire. If we lose fire, we don't get out of this cave alive. He looked intently into the faces of his men. You saw how dark it was in that entry chute. Without these torches, this whole cave would be just as dark. We can't lose fire, he repeated slowly and emphatically. Everybody's got 7 torches. That's 42 torches between us, minus the pair that's already lit, makes 40. That's 20 pair, 10 for the trip out, 10 for the trip back. He paused. He wanted to be sure everybody heard him. When 10 pair of torches are burned, we turn for home. But Gustus, interrupted Arliss, what if we haven't made it to the other side yet? I don't care. I don't care if we haven't made it out of this entry chamber yet. I don't care if we're so close we can smell Perthins, answered Gustus. When we light the 11th pair of torches, we turn it around. It don't serve any purpose for us to die in a hole for lack of fire to get out. Arliss saw the logic in this. He submitted to his foreman. A torch burns 3/4 of an hour, continued Gustus. That gives us about 7 hours to find the Perthin camp. So let's move. The torches are burning. Taking Aiden's torch, Gustus led the way along the edge of the lake. He, Ernest, and Cedric formed a trio, and behind them, Arliss and Aiden walked in the light of Clayton's torch. It was a relatively easy hike at first, but the lakeside path was not straight. The lake wound its way beneath the earth like a great tunneling snake, and Aiden quickly lost all sense of direction. Are we sure we're headed the right way? He whispered to Arliss. Let's hope the path takes a left-hand turn, Arliss whispered back. We're tacking just a little north of due west. No sun, no stars, Aiden observed. I don't see how you can tell. Arliss tapped his helmet. Miner's head. Pap had it, Grandpap had it, and I got it too. The underground landscape, as much as they could see anyway, changed constantly. In places, the lake disappeared completely, dropping away to an even deeper tunnel than the one they were passing through. In places, fields of massive stalagmites stood like whole forests of cypress knees, broad at the base and tapering toward the top. Where the ceiling was lower, they got a good look at the stalactites hanging ponderously over their heads. All around them echoed the drip, drip, drip of seeping groundwater, heavy with dissolved limestone. It dropped from the bottoms of stalactites to the top of stalagmites, leaving one more molecule of limestone on the tip of each, growing them toward each other in the slow way of underground things. In places, the stalactites and stalagmites met to form great pillars from floor to ceiling, monuments to the patient work of water and limestone. In other places, the ceiling was covered with thin, hollow formations like drinking straws. A droplet of water hung from each, and they shone like jewels in the torchlight. The walls, too, were infinitely varied in color and texture, now white and smooth as alabaster, now striped red and white like bacon, now gray and muddy. The ground they walked on was sometimes smooth and slick, sometimes crunchy with bits of deposited limestone. But mostly it was mud they walked on, or through. Slippery mud, sticky mud, ankle deep in places. In some places, even deeper, threatening to take a boot and keep it. For the first 2 hours of the trip, the way was broad and the ceiling high enough that the company could walk upright. Though their way was winding, it wasn't a maze. There had been only one path. They appeared to be making good time, and their spirits were high. As a bird flies, it wasn't more than a half a league from the east entrance of the cave, where they came in, to the entrance on the Perthen side. "We can't be far now," remarked Ernest. "We're on our third pair of torches, and we've been walking steady this whole time." After a brief hesitation, Arliss spoke up. "We're not as close as you think. We've been walking due north the last half hour." "Due north?" snorted Clayton. "What makes you say that?" Arliss tapped his helmet. Gustus sighed. "The boy's got the miner's head. That's why we brought him along." He was visibly disappointed. "So, Arliss, you say we've been making good time in the wrong direction?" "Yes, sir," answered Arliss. "This path doesn't turn south and west soon. We're not going to make it in time." The miners looked at one another in gloomy silence. Their good cheer was extinguished. "Cheer up, boys," said Gustus as jauntily as he could. "We got plenty of fire left before it's time to turn around. Meantime, there's only one way to go, so let's go." He forged ahead and in the opposite direction of where they knew their destination to be. The miner scouts followed, but their tensions grew with every step. The miners had just lit a new pair of torches, their fourth, when they faced their first real navigational choice. A tunnel coming in from the left joined the corridor they had been following. Gustus stood in the intersection of the two passages. "Which way, Arliss?" he asked. Arliss stood beside his foreman. "The big passage is pointing northwest. This new one points southwest." A cheer erupted and echoed around the limestone walls. They all knew they needed to turn southwest eventually. "Hurrah!" shouted Clayton, patting Arliss on the back as he squeezed past him to lead the way down the new passage. Falling in behind him, the rest of the party broke into happy song. "Fol-de-rol-de-dee-rol-de, fol-de-rol-de-roll, dee-fol-de-rol-de-fiddly, fol-de-roll." "Stop!" The miner's singing was interrupted by a shout from Arliss, who still stood in the intersection of the two passageways. The surprised miners looked quizzically at their young comrade. He stood with his shoulders slumped and his eyes averted, the posture of a person with sad news to tell. "That's not the way." Gustus looked at him confused. "Pardon?" "That's not the way, sir." "But you said this way goes southwest," spluttered Clayton. "The Perthen camp lies southwest of here. That's the one of the few things we know for sure." "It's a dead end," said Arliss. "I can feel it." "Oh, no," groaned Ernest. "It's the miner's head again." Clayton moved towards Arliss. His thick hand was clenched into a fist. "I think it's time I knock some sense into that miner's head." Gustus quickly stepped between them. "Tamp it down, Clayton. Everybody's feeling a little sharpish. Let's hear what the boy has to say." He turned to Arliss. "What do you mean, you feel a dead end?" "You remember the long shaft of the Greasy Cave mines?" "Since long before you was born," answered Clayton. "It's got two entrances, north and south, and the main tunnel runs between them." "Right," answered Gustus. "Then there's spur shafts running off to the left and right. Right?" "Get to the point." Clayton was losing patience. "The point is," continued Arliss, "the air feels different in the main tunnel than it does in the spurs. The air in the spurs shaft is a little staler. In the main tunnel, there's the slightest movement of air." He took a few steps down the southward tunnel. "Here the air is dead, like a spur shaft." He stepped back into the main corridor. "Here I can feel just a tiny bit of air current." The rest of the miners stepped back into the main corridor. "I don't feel any difference," Clayton grumbled. "I don't know," offered Cedric. "It might be a little fresher out here, but I wouldn't bet on it either way." Aiden, for his part, couldn't tell any difference. It all felt dank and musty to him. "Gustus, what do you think?" asked Ernest. "You're the foreman of this outfit." Don't matter much what I think about air currents and stale air, answered Gustus. Don't imagine I could tell the difference, but I do know we brought Arliss because he's got the miner's head. Clayton groaned at this. Gustus flashed a sharp look in his direction and then continued. More than once his daddy's instincts got me out of scrapes down the mines. Some folks is just born to be underground. Arliss and his family is about half mole, so if Arliss don't feel good about that passage, I don't feel good about it. We'll carry on the way we've been going. You can't mean it, shouted Clayton, his voice echoing around the cavern. That tunnel points in the direction where we know the Perthens camp to be, and you're going to send us in the opposite direction because of this boy's hocus pocus. Gustus answered Clayton's outburst with a quiet question. What makes you think that tunnel leads southwest? Clayton saw he was trapped. Gustus pressed the point. I want you to tell me how you know that passage leads southwest and this one leads northwest. Clayton answered without looking at anyone. Because Arliss said so. Because Arliss said so, repeated Gustus. Without Arliss here, we wouldn't even have a sense enough to know if this was north, south, east, or west. So if you're still got a hankering to explore that tunnel, go ahead. We'll pick you up on our way back. The rest of us are going this way. Gustus shouldered his pack and led the way northward again, and Clayton, who fell into step with the rest of the group, wasn't the only miner scout who looked back wistfully at the southward passage as it melted into blackness.